but we'll be speaking to one of the senior advisors, close to the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, about how he sees our future here in the United Kingdom as we move towards Brexit. What's going to be happening to us? We haven't come out yet, and yet still, we still continue to fight the same battle our parents or forefathers, our mothers have fought, and we still continue to see those creeping up again in front of our eyes. What shall we do? He says, wait. Well, here we are this day, midweek Wednesday, listening to Feferity Radio. And on the line, I have with me the former senior advisor, policy advisor for equalities to the former London Mayor, Ken Livingstone. He's on the line. I want to welcome him here on Feferity Radio. So, Mr. Lee Jasper, welcome, sir.
Hi, glad to be here.
Great. It's good to have you here, sir.
Yeah, you're playing some cool tracks too. That's even better.
That's why we call it a nostalgic station, because we throw you all the throwbacks. Thank you. Well, how has it been for you since leaving office?
Very busy, doing various things. People have seen me leading up particular campaigns, supporting people who find themselves as victims of injustice in one way or another, highlighting issues, working with refugee communities, doing some international consultancy. So, yeah, I've been keeping very busy, developing organizations and social movements like Black Socks.
Black
Socks? BLAK. Yeah, BLAKSOX.
Uh-huh.
Just look up blacksocks.com. It's a legacy movement which is about people of my age really coming together.
You said in your 30s, you mean?
Sorry?
People of your age in their 30s?
I'm in my 30s, did you say? I can't quite hear you.
That's what I heard. People of your age.
No. I wish I was in my 30s. Yes. No. I'm 62, but so far in advance of those ages. But people of my age category
mm-hmm.
Have come together really to see what legacy we can work on. And we're a self-funded, independent movement with black professionals committing their time and their money to put on certain events that we think are in need in the community, whether that's mental health or public health, emotional intelligence training or community organizing across the capital in the UK. That and some research I've been doing. I did some research on young black people and their views about cannabis legalization.
Mm-hmm.
So we keep you very busy. Got my own radio show, Lee Jasper Drive Time. You can look that up on YouTube. You see some hard-hitting interviews with victims of racism from our community. Yes. Very busy.
I mean, you deal with that on your blog as well. I mean, racism, you cover a lot of issue on that. When you said Black Socks and you said a group of black professionals, do you want to explain more about those professionals? I mean, what sort of stream they're coming from? I mean, is it just economics or engineers or who are they?
They're right across the board, really. They're, people who work in the charitable sector, people who've got their own businesses, people, maybe running care homes, people that are event promoters, people who are community activists in their own right, psychologists, barristers. It's an open group, so anybody can come along and the only proviso is will you contribute either your time or your money, or sometimes both, to work on things we all agree need to work on. So it's that kind of environment, and it attracts quite a wide spectrum of individuals.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. So you've been really keeping yourself absolutely busy and engaged with the community. Yeah, fantastic. Well, coming back, looking back at your time with the former Mayor Ken Livingstone. I mean, we tend to forget about him now because it's such a long time. But when you
Absolutely.
look back in terms of your role as a senior policy advisor on equalities, I mean, have you seen any progression?
No, I think it's regression. I think the last time we saw things moving forward was at the time when Ken Livingstone was mayor of the city. Free travel for under 16s, discounted travel for those that are unemployed, investment in cultural activities, in all of the major ethnic groupings in the capital. A strong stance against discrimination, increased the number of black and ethnic minority police officers by 100% when Ken was in power. Mind you, that sounds a lot, but we start from a very low base, so it's more impressive than it sounds. But nevertheless, increased that by 100%, leading to the largest ever recruitments in our community ever seen. So more black senior police officers then than we do now at the senior command at the Metropolitan Police Service. We've seen a drop in a rise in black youth unemployment, a rise in black adult unemployment, particularly black women who've borne the brunt of public sector cuts, mostly employed in local authorities or public sector organisations in the middle tier administrative level or junior management level. Those are the ones that have suffered greatly in terms of forced redundancies for the cuts, and so a disproportionate rise in black women's unemployment. We're seeing growing racial inequality in terms of health, mental health, physical health, obesity levels. So we're really showing the signs of a community that has been immersed far too long in long-term poverty. Given the level of unemployment and the high level of child poverty and the poor access to housing in the areas where we live, this should be really no surprise to anybody.
Yes, indeed. I mean, when we focus, Lee, on, inequality or injustices and on blacks, recently there was a debate on the BBC, I think, Melanin Vote, and there were disabled members of the community there. And what they were saying, they experienced discrimination from both, sets of community, black and white. When you look at the discrimination proportion here, in terms of black, we don't hear about black disabled, disproportionate discrimination or benefits. I mean, what do you make of the blacks, black people who are also disabled? I mean, do you know anything about their difficulties and what they go through?
I was fortunate to be head of equalities at my time in the mayor's office, and so we had a disability capital conference every year in which disabled activists and community organisations and charitable organisations and so on would come together and talk about the access issues in the capital. And it quickly dawned on me that people with disabilities suffer from a sort of physical apartheid in the capital. And it was always deeply impressed on me. Not only do disabled people face real discrimination, but the black communities within that, black and ethnic minorities, face a double whammy. One of which is the rank prejudice that still exists within our own community in relation to those of us who are disabled, as well as the broader institutionalized racism that they have to deal with from others. So I was always very keen. And I always remember reading a book called Incurably Human. If you haven't read that book, it's written by a disabled activist. But it's an incredible, Incurably Human. Yeah. My brain is so aged, I can't remember the author of it. She was a disabled activist, very prominent in the disability movement, especially focusing on direct action. And I met her. She sadly passed now, I think. And I met her when she was alive. My head of disability at the Greater London Authority, was somebody who had very complex disability, and he was precisely picked. Sorry,
is that Dr. Alice Robert?
No. His name was David, and I can't remember his surname. It's so long ago now, 10, 12 years ago. You mean the person who wrote the book?
Who wrote the book? Yes. Incredible Human.
Incredible Human. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
So my head of disability at the GLA was somebody who was a bit like me, a proper activist in the disabled community. That was always Ken Livingstone's preference. He didn't just want apparatchiks and bureaucrats or people with degrees. He actually wanted people who'd been involved in trying to reform and change society. So both with race in terms of myself and disability, he would pick people. We would employ people at a senior policy level who had, very much lived experience. So a lot of the work that we saw come out of the organisation at the time was very much, leading, one of the first to recognise British Sign Language, was driven by the head of disability policy at the GLA, who sadly too has passed. So another loss to the movement.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking through your blog, very, very interesting articles there, and I really encourage everyone to go and look at it. And I came across this story. I mean, this was in January this year, about Mr. Gilbert Wade, who was actually thrown off the coach. I mean, coming from London, between Cardiff to London, actually. And when you read that story, and then recently you heard about the police officer, Robin Williams, who was basically found guilty of possessing something that she didn't know about at all. I mean, that is so much. It brings to mind, when you look at that story and what is happening to now, I mean, it brings to mind the present situation that we faced here as black people, regardless of the position that one holds in the community, no matter how long it is. What's the danger really for those who, not danger, but those who really are really doing their best to make things work in this society, but yet, face this upheaval about equality and proving oneself?
I think two things. I think one, the general atmosphere in the country has deteriorated. So, the kind of racism that I'm now covering and hearing, and you can read about on my blog or visit on the YouTube channel, is racism that really should have been consigned and dealt with. And we thought we had dealt with in the run-up and the conclusion of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. That was supposed to be the watershed moment where, from then on, progressive equality was made. All right, not all immediate revolution, but at least consistent progress over the years. And since 2008, of course, what we've seen is a massive increase in racial inequality. And so we're actually worse off as a community than we were then. And the present sort of economic climate and the social atmosphere in Britain is one in which, racism has just been given a complete green light. People feel inhibited about discriminating against people. The government sets the tone with the sort of deportation of black British citizens who were illegally deported to places around the world, affecting the Windrush scandal affecting over 15,000 people. People actually died because they couldn't get access to NHS treatment because they'd been deemed not to be a citizen by this government. And so the hostility, the hostile environment that we see, both in terms of Mr. Wade when he's thrown off a bus, a man of a Windrush generation, a working man. He's going back to work that particular evening, catching the late night coach so he can be there at 6 a.m. in the morning and get straight to work. And he's summarily dragged off a coach in the way that has been described. And equally, when we look at Robin Williams, here is an officer, Chief Inspector Robin Williams, who personally I've known for 30 years. And during that time, she's been the epitome of an ethical officer, albeit we didn't agree from time to time. There were lots of times when I felt that she was less publicly critical of the police than she could have been or should have been. But nevertheless, I had tremendous respect for her as an officer, because somebody chooses to do something a different way doesn't mean that they can be any less effective, or indeed that they're necessarily wrong. And she was an extraordinarily lovely person to boot. So being friends with her was very easy, and I was always impressed during my association with her at the extent to which she always exhibited the most consummate professionalism. But even when there were challenging times, and there were many in terms of black community police relations, she would be the one who would bring the sensible approach to both sides to, find a way forward. So I had tremendous respect for her as a serving police officer. Yeah. And that she could have been treated in this way. And I say that because although she's found guilty, and people will say, well, the court went through due process and so on, the facts of the matter are there was an image on her phone which she didn't open. That was categorically proven by the technicians in court. She hadn't viewed it. No. It was sent to her by her sister, who was with a tagline, "These people should be locked up." Yeah. She'd not seen it. No. And the mere fact that she had it on her phone, even though she hadn't seen it, was a technical breach of the law for which the police decided to prosecute her. Now, the police have discretion to prosecute people. There are other police officers who similarly had images on their phone and not been prosecuted.
I mean, the fact
that they chose to end this police officer's career, which was a stellar career, 2 years away from retirement. She would have retired with a pension, no doubt gone into consultancy. Right. This upstanding black woman in our community has had her reputation traduced on the basis of the most appalling evidence that I've seen brought against a senior police officer. I can't think of any white senior officer of that rank that would have been treated similarly in that way. Yeah. And again, I think it's just an negation of, the resurgent level of institutionalized racism, personal racism, cultural racism in our schools, in our places and places of work.
Yeah. I mean, it is quite really pathetic and nasty. I mean, there are people like, when you look at a record and what the judge said, and for her to be sort of reduced to this level, I mean, those who are, as black people, doing, like I said, trying to be upstanding, doing the right thing, do they have any chance? I mean, that will lead me to the next question, actually, because I've got so many questions here from people who have sent me. This is from Kilimanjaro. I think this leads, straight to this situation that we're talking about. He says, what exactly are the position of black people in the UK?
What is the position?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about Britain that you have to understand is that we have the most hyper-diverse African diaspora community, probably any country in the world, certainly more diverse than Canada and New York. So in Britain, we have Africans from almost a community of Africans from almost every country in Africa. Added to that, we have European Africans who are either from former Caribbean colonies, be they French or English, and the same is true for Africans from the continent. Many from French-speaking countries here in the United Kingdom as well. And so it's unlike anywhere else in the world insofar as that all of these communities have come together in very recent times and seeking to work together. Now, in terms of what the state for the black community is, well, then you have to look at the research statistics. And there is a website called the government has on its own site called the Race Disparity Unit website. And I urge people to go in there when they have some time and look at some of the figures which demonstrate racial inequality. So from birth, black children are twice as likely to die in their first year of life than white children. Their mothers are also more likely to die in the course of childbirth than any of the ethnic groups. Children more likely to live in poverty, more likely to live in long-term unemployment, more likely to be expelled from school. There is a differential in terms of educational achievement with African children from the African continent tending to perform better in schools than their Caribbean or British-born counterparts. Then you have a disproportionate number of us heading for university, so lots of us striving for education, but we do have 32% black graduate unemployment in the country. We have 55% black youth unemployment in the country. That's 1 in 2 black youth. And just to point out the scale of that, it's the highest rate of any ethnic employment group in Europe. The unemployment rate of Palestinian youth on the West Bank Gaza is 46%. Greece, which is roundly considered as an economic basket case, and still paying its debt back to the European Union, its youth unemployment rate is 49%. So you can see the extent to which we've got long-term unemployment and poverty established in our community. And really, we've had those high levels of unemployment and poverty since we arrived here in big numbers. We've actually been in the United Kingdom for over 2,000 years, but in big numbers, certainly since the 50s. And other than a brief period of economic growth between the 60s and the mid-70s, where the British economy was much more vigorous, more employment and job opportunities. Since then, we've really seen a lowering of life chances. And this translates, long-term poverty translates into more likely in relation to mental health, more likely to be victims of crime, more likely to suffer physical ill health. That's the position of black people in the UK. If you are, unless you're very educated here in the United Kingdom, then it's enormously difficult. And even where you are educated, it can still be, as I said, faced uphill struggle. 32% black graduate unemployment means we've got people with law degrees stacking shelves in Sainsbury's, and the environment is only getting worse. So those rates of racial inequality are growing.
I mean,
not declining.
It is. I mean, it's a very, very, very bleak, future when you look at all the statistics for blacks here, and especially what happened recently with Robin Williams. The superintendent. I mean, you think to yourself, what's the point? I think probably this is the questions a lot of, educated blacks or blacks in general are asking themselves. I mean, being in position, for a long time, what is the point? Because you can just get picked up and switch off like that easily.
Absolutely. I think that it's even more rationale for black people in the workplace to organize themselves and to make sure that they're not simply, entering the workplace as an individual, but part of an organized group that exerts some leverage and some influence. They've got to get involved in their own trade union movement. They've got to organize black workers groups to ensure race equality is high on the agenda. But most people want to go to work, keep their heads down, not get involved in anything too controversial, and then therefore tend not to want to get in anything, in quotes, political. I think the consequence of that is that we see the growth in the kind of really vicious institutionalized racism that Robin Williams has been the victim of. But I have to say, I've got doctors, Nigerian doctors, I've teachers, lesser ranking police officers, security guards, bus drivers, dentists, all suffering in one way or another from the effects of this resurgent institutionalized racism. But of course, the thing is in the broader context, of course, the world has never been so mobile and opportunities have never been so frequent. Certainly on the continent of Africa, there's lots of economic opportunity. And just as our parents left their countries of origin to come here when times were good so that they could secure their financial futures, I think that, we must be less attached to the country and look to seek to develop opportunities abroad. And of course, it doesn't have to leave the country and move abroad. These days, one can do international business in Peckham whilst trading, throughout the continent. So there's lots of opportunities beyond the immediate ones presented here in the United Kingdom. And I would encourage people to look more globally to where economies, particularly those in East Africa, but other African nations too, where economic growth is remarkable, 6 to 7% a year.
Yeah.
These are the kind of figures that European nations would die for.
Yeah, I mean, Lee, I've always looked through this situation. I mean, like the black, prosperity here, black development, black businesses, and because obviously I came from Sierra Leone as a teenager, but looking through, and I said, each time I ask myself, I've seen a lot of, we've had excellent, programs, television programs, comedy, dramas from the 70s or 60s. We've had, members in the community who've held higher positions. And I look through, compared to, say, America, which we all look forward to, I haven't seen, I'm talking specifically of British blacks who were born here. I haven't seen any development created by the blacks who were born. We don't have theaters. We don't have cinema. Look what happened recently with a young man who's trying to put out his movie. We don't have halls, that we could perform our music, bring our artists and say, this is our venue. We don't have. Why do you think that is? I'm not talking about, because you made mention of the development that's happening elsewhere, in Africa and elsewhere. If we look at the invention of radio station, whether I call it pirates or something, like even television stations that we do have here, all of them have been sort of generated by those who came. Why do you think that is so difficult for those who were born here to actually create and build something for those who are coming to say, yes, we've got something here?
Well, I think, you're looking at history from the standpoint of today. All of those things the black community used to have in more abundance than it does today. There were periods. My grandfather was from Sierra Leone. He was the chairman of the local crew club in Manchester. They owned the building. They ran courts in relation to family disputes and settlements, and tracked down errant husbands and made sure the wife was paid a stipendiary while she was waiting for her husband to be found. That people bought buildings and assets and clubs. Unfortunately, that generation, lots of them, particularly from the Caribbean, sold up and went home when the property boom came to the United Kingdom. Such was the money that they could command for their property, that a lot of them took the options of getting back home. I think the reality is that the level of quality of education in this country, unless one's going to private school, is really a lottery and determined where you live. And the poor quality education has always resided, not just for black kids, but for white kids who live in those areas too, in the areas where black and ethnic minority communities are greatly located. I think the other thing in comparing ourselves with other people like America and so on, and even East Africa, is that you're looking at communities in the African American sense. You're looking at a continuous community with a homogeneous culture, albeit with some, East Coast, West Coast regional differences. That is homogeneous and has been there for 350 years. When African Americans walked up the plantation 350 years ago, they set up their churches. The assets that you see them now is 350 years worth of development to get them where they are today. In East Africa, of course, you've got a greater cultural homogeneity across, and on the East Africa free trade area, you've got a market, which is absolutely massive. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So the economic opportunities there currently right now are much greater than they are here. I think over in the United Kingdom, we've had to suffer discrimination in the financial services sector. So we've long campaigned to say that banks should release their data in relation to ethnic lending or investment in local businesses, because we believe that, and I think a Bank of England analysis of a report demonstrated that black people, particularly British black people and people of African descent, had faced greater discrimination in trying to access bank loans when compared to white colleagues. And yet had a lesser failure rate as first-time investment for business than their white counterparts. So there's been institutional discrimination in housing, and then of course when large-scale unemployment came around in the United Kingdom, starting really in the mid-70s and extending into the 80s, the black community was massively disproportionately hit. So I think that recently arrived migrants have come from a culturally consistent, experience in terms of their language, culture, religion, and morals and values. Whereas in the United Kingdom, I think that the black community has always been the outsider community, the British black community. And now that we're joined by, millions of people from across the African continent, more and more Africans themselves who maybe believed that Britain was a meritocracy, where if you did the work and you qualified, that you would be rewarded for your efforts. And what you find, of course, is what the resident black community here found all along, that there is open discrimination, and that makes economic development much more difficult than it would otherwise would be. But I also think that we are also a perfect consumer group, aren't we? I mean, everybody wants what the world's got to sell, be it Gucci, be it this. Everybody wants to live the consumer lifestyle, and as a community, we've tended in this country to adopt the "I'm all right, Jack." If me and my family are okay, then maybe I don't need to bother about anybody else in the community. I mean, it's a very short-term economy, but that's where we are.
Yeah. I mean, also, do you think, though, because, when we discuss our issues here, we always look for help from those who are really putting us in the same situation that we are. You think that's one of the problems?
I think it's a big problem. And I think that, we have to begin to look internally and say, okay, we do have enough resources to make a difference to our own lives. We can invest in our children's education. We can invest in business startup opportunities, the international platform for young black people in this country. We can do that. We have enough consumers spending power that we see directed to Sky TV or the nice cars or the hair and makeup. We see lots of money being pumped in terms of that expenditure and leisure time expenditure. We're one of the communities with the highest levels of leisure expenditure, whether that's dining out or going out at the weekends or whatever. And so it's not the lack of money, but I think that because we haven't had the kind of long-term development of the black church, particularly in America, just post-slavery, that, formed itself into institutions, formed itself into credit unions, began very much to focus. And in America, you had to, because there was no welfare system, you had to look to your own resources. You saw that development take place very much more quicker in the States than you did here. And as I said previously, they've had many more decades, many more centuries than we have being here since only the 1950s, 60s, in any great number.
I mean,
so
yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's a complex and it's not an easy situation, and you've got to think about the movements and the travels of peoples from the former colonial empires all back to the United Kingdom. And that makes our situation and the degree to which we can get some unity in working together a little more difficult, because we have to include Somali, we have to include Senegalese, we have to include Nigerian, we have to include Ghanaian, we have to include Jamaican, we have to include Black British, and I could go on through the variants.
Well,
and then you begin to see, you begin to see the complexity of the thing when not everybody has their own religious beliefs and cultural beliefs and particular indigenous institutions.
So do you think that we feed more on those cultural aspect of ourselves rather than the collective? Because it's like when we talk here, we're so divided as blacks in the United Kingdom. Like you said, you know what I mean? It's like it's like we're Caribbean or we're African or we're British. We don't seem to really speak with one voice, and probably our unity and development is taking a bit longer.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that's just a consequence of more recently arrived communities. I mean, the African community population in the UK has exploded, but only really since about the year 2002, 3, 4. And so we've seen, what looks, on paper is coming close to 1 million people from the African continent over the last 20 years moving to the United Kingdom. So that's people who come without the lived experience of being here in Britain, may not be aware of the political history of the struggle against racial equality, may come from a background which, as I say, has that very, very colonial old belief that, England is a country of meritocracy and gentlemen and so on and so forth. And the realities of racism are certainly making themselves known, but they've had less time to become accustomed and attuned or figure out how best to respond to that. There's only one way to respond to it, and that is to form unity amongst organisations. And we really need a national organisation for ourselves. It's long overdue.
It is. I mean, we it's like we have a lot of think tankers. We have a lot of committee of think tanks, who just think about this situation, but we don't have practical people who says, well, let's do what we need to do for ourselves and take control for our own destiny. So we engage in more intellectual, thinking around issues that we know we can't solve intellectually.
No, absolutely. It's our think tanks have brought us to a place where we're suffering a paralysis of analysis, and we need less and more action. Yeah, that is absolutely the truth.
Well, I mean, we're coming into the election, and I'm looking at your article, actually, the watermelon file. This is very interesting, article there. And you says Boris Johnson's record on racism. And what I'm really interested in here, you talked about your own views, and you says your own view is that much of Boris's classical racism is camouflaged by his undoubted charm and witty repertoire, and this kind of racism become so much more residuals and damaging as a result. Could you elaborate on that further? Because there is a lot of questions here about the Brexit and the black condition. And could you elaborate on your article and your views about Boris Johnson as a classical racist?
Yeah, your Boris Johnson is the old colonial type of Eastern gentleman whose condescension for other peoples is so great that he's not afraid to publicly defame and decry other ethnic minorities. He sees that very much as part of his white privileged entitlement from the born to rule class, much less and that's how he feels about his fellow white Englishmen, much less how he feels about people who purport to be black British. This is managing his government is engaged in the hostile environment and the winter deportations. As mayor of London, he devastated black community relations with the mayor's office. So we saw the rises in black youth unemployment. We saw the rises in levels of poverty. We saw a reduction in the number of black officers in the police service. We saw slash funding for the black voluntary sector. He was engaged in levels of corruption to prevent black contractors accessing contracts at City Hall, and that's a matter of public record.
Reduction of nurses as well.
Absolutely. You can get all the links to these stories, so you can corroborate what I'm saying, are in my article. It's called The Watermelon Files, and people should go and read it. And I think that, Britons are the most sophisticated and charming racists in the world. You would never know you were being discriminated.
I mean, when you say sophisticated and charming, that is like leaves you with no choice but to really fall for it.
Absolutely.
And that's not the case. It shouldn't be the case.
It's classic dinner party racism, isn't it? It's a polite racism of the ruling classes, whose racism is usually clothed in glowing compliments and huge smiles and big hugs. So the English have long practiced their ability to be able to smile in your face, makes you think that you are everything's all right and they're respecting you. Yeah. Meanwhile, their real agenda is that they have no respect for you at all. And Boris is of this character. He's like those old benign colonial characters on the continent.
It's just the way he talks. Who
would charm the local elders and make them think he was a good guy. He's still ripping them off as much as the bad guy. But, a bit like Bill Clinton, he played the saxophone and liked black people, so that was all okay.
But there was more people in prison when he was on, and death. Yeah, I mean, there's another question. In relation to Brexit, if I may, I just think Brexit's a disaster for black people. I think the history of Europe is one that any time that European economies face economic decline, particularly severe economic decline, but even mild economic decline, racism rises. And Britain now with Brexit, as it's a triumph of racism over economics. People have actually voted to be less diverse and less wealthy if they can be more diverse. That's the crutch of Brexit. We don't want so many foreigners over here. We want to control our own borders and kick them all out. And if that means we're going to be poorer, we're happy to be poorer as long as it means less of you guys. Yeah.
So, that's the essence of Brexit for me. And so it's a triumph of racism over economics, because even big business is very clear on its position about it being a disaster for the economy.
Yeah.
Now, this is my message to Africans and recently arrived migrants. You probably haven't been here when we've had a severe recession. But when we have a severe recession, racism in this country becomes massively amplified. It becomes much more vicious. It becomes much more open. Becomes much more discriminatory and hostile. And so I think that looking forward to the future with this perennial Brexit negotiations, we're going to see ourselves suffering an economic recession. And I think the primary victims are going to be disproportionately poor communities, black and ethnic minority communities.
Yeah, I mean, you've already touched on it, but there's one question here from Ebony asking, have race relations got worse or better after the announcement of Brexit? And how can we overturn a racist government?
Say that again, sorry. Where is it?
Have race relations got worse or better after the announcment of Brexit? And how can we overturn a racist government?
That was good. Sorry, I get something popped into my ear. Can you say that one more time?
The last one is, how can we overturn a racist government?
Well, you have to get organized. Do you want to overturn a racist government, or do you want to improve your own community? I mean, what's your policy? I think it should be dual at the same time. I think, one, of course, you want to overthrow a racist government, and that's why, the fact that 25% of us are not registered to vote is an absolute outrage. By
25% of the blacks?
By not voting, and that goes up amongst young people. By not voting, you're actually giving a vote to the status quo. So you're literally voting for more racism, more police discrimination, more unemployment, because that's exactly the trajectory a government will take when it faces no real opposition against its discrimination and racism. But people have to get very busy in terms of the broader political agenda, register to vote, make sure they get out there and organise themselves. And secondly, we have to do much more for ourselves. We can't keep depending on these people for a government handout to solve our issues and our problems. Our communities must be of a Pan-African variety, which says, let's get together, let's see what we have, what we can share, and what we're prepared to invest. And now, one hand can wash the other, and we can create an internal economy where we can try and support and invest and, promote the kind of economic development within our community that would build a sustainable economy for the future. And key to doing that is looking beyond Britain into the global economy, to look into new technologies of trade. In Africa, it's the largest mobile money market in the world. Even more people have mobile money on their mobile phones than in China. And so the extent to which you can now go online and start to trade, second-hand bicycles from the UK imported to Africa, you can make a business from that. You can look to recycle other goods from here in the United Kingdom that could be transported. You could trade Bitcoin on the internet. There is so many opportunities.
People don't still
even
trust
if
that
you're here in the
Bitcoin
United
at
Kingdom.
the moment. It's not really assured, isn't it? People are not comfortable with that at the moment.
Yeah, some people are, some people aren't. What I'm saying is, to explore all the possibilities and opportunities for economic development is what we should be doing. And primary amongst that is saying, what does Africa need, and how can we work here to create businesses that can provide that, and also, get partnerships with African companies about their goods being imported into the United Kingdom. These are all distinct possibilities. If we leave Europe in a Brexit deal, then we can start to negotiate. Britain will have to negotiate trade deals with African countries.
This is two questions. One is why have the number of black councillors dropped? And also, if you could point to people, about this, to this general election, about who to trust, the Conservative or the Labour Party, who would you direct the focus to?
You've got to vote for Labour. You can't vote for a Tory party that's been engaged in, the most discriminatory and hostile immigration system policy we've ever seen since we landed here in large numbers. The Tory party is institutionally racist. Its policies, since it introduced these public sector cuts, have left our communities, which were already economically deprived prior to the 2008 crash. Now they're living in an economic abyss with people working two jobs, children that barely see their parents because they're working so hard to try and earn enough money to pay their rent and bills in particularly in areas like London. All of these are massive economic pressures, and I think that as we saw with Ken Livingstone in City Hall, that economic pressure can be alleviated by things like free transport for the under-16s, the railways being nationalised and having cheaper transport for people, making a commitment to build 150,000 council houses. So, at the moment, most black families who live in the capital are seeing their families being broken up because none of their children can afford to live anywhere near London. And can't get started on the housing ladder. So the social impact of, that economic situation leads to fragmented families living in Brighton, Auntie lives in Manchester, somebody else, and that's not good for our communities either. So my view would be for an investment in public policy, an investment in education, housing and the National Health Service, you've got to vote Labour, and that would be my strong recommendation.
And why do you think the number of the black councillors have dropped?
I think that politics is not particularly appealing to black people because I think we've all got the message, haven't we, that as soon as you try and lead anything and you're genuine and authentic and wanting to change anything, that they take you out. Absolutely. And so if you've got to be in that politics, you've got to keep your mouth shut and toe the line. And that's a deeply depressing and unsatisfying place to be. And lots of young people will not tolerate that and won't put up with it, and have chosen not to get involved in a politics that, sells itself as being open and inclusive to all.
Yeah.
But when you actually get into it, you find out it's business as usual. And so people are not inclined to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, this one is all the way from Italy. There's a listener in Italy, and it says, following the massive immigration from Africa and other countries, that is in Europe, what do you think if the situation of black people in other European countries, like say Italy, for example?
Well, I think the African presence in Europe is in a very precarious situation, largely because of the enormous growth of extreme right-wing parties and open fascists who are being elected into democratic institutions of many European countries. Clearly, Europe is moving to the right politically and becoming increasingly hostile to migrants. And we saw, didn't we, the pitiful response of the European Union to the thousands of African migrants who died in the drowned in the Mediterranean, and they had not one jot of compassion. Could they care not whether we lived or died? And I think that as the economic crisis worsens in Europe, and there are two reasons why I think it will. I think one is that they're caught in a bind. They're trying to stop immigration into Europe, but the European birthright is collapsing through the floor. And so they don't have enough people of their own to fulfill the requirements of the labour force going forward. So, for instance, in a city like London, 80% of the predicted workforce between now and 2030 will be from black and ethnic minority communities, and a substantive portion of that will be black, African and Caribbean people and people of descent. So, I think that it's very dangerous for black people in Europe at the moment. I think the Eastern European countries have seen a massive increase in racism throughout Europe as their peoples move around Europe and settle in places like the United Kingdom. We've seen increases in racism towards black people from people of those countries. So, my view is that we would be better off in unison with the, nearly 30 million people of African descent that are in the European Union, rather than being 1.2 million here in the United Kingdom against the 59 million of white Britons who will be against us.
We need
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Another one here from Lorna. We haven't got much to go now. There's many, many questions coming in. I don't think we're not going to be touching on them today. But this is one I thought is very important from Lorna. It says, what advice would you give to black people thinking of going into politics or police, or encourage them through encourage them through the process? Rather than to become discouraged. So what advice would you give to people who want to go into politics or the police force?
I think what you've got to do is you've got to do your research. The police force is not one thing right across the country. Different police service forces, have got their own traditions and their ways of doing things. Some are better, some are worse. And so you've got to do your research in those areas. If you want to go into the police service, that's fine, but at least know what you're taking on. And you can do that by looking at, Googling your police service and see to what extent racism has been a problem for black officers in the force. You could contact your local Black Police Officers Association and go and have a coffee with one of them and ask them what their experience is and, what they would advise. I would definitely join an organisation like the Black Police Officers Association, because I think the more black officers entering the force who join that increases their level of, collective protection and bargaining power when they're trying to protect themselves from institutionalised racism, which is inevitably part of the job. So I think if you want to go in, then go in both eyes open. My own personal view is that whilst the job of the police service is something that we should definitely aspire to, I don't think the culture of the police service as it stands today is a welcoming place for black people. So I think sometimes it reminds me of the analogy of pouring good wine into a broken glass. You can keep pouring the wine, but you're not improving the situation, and you lose as many as you recruit. And if you know black police recruits have the highest rate of fallout of any ethnic group within the first 2 years of police training. So clearly difficulties, and it's challenging. But the more we are self-organized as black professionals, whether it's in policing or teaching or whatever, then the greater level of protection you would do. And if you're going into these professions, do your research. You wouldn't go, when you go to an organization, you're making a big commitment. You need to know if they've got a history of racism. You need to look up the employment tribunals and see if that company's listed as being found guilty of racism. You need to Google, the news stories and see to what extent they may have any background, and talk to black people who already work there so you can get a sense of it. So just like buying a house, really, just, do that little bit of extra due diligence so that you can make an informed choice, whatever you choose to decide to do.
Yeah. And this is another one from Barchak. It says, are you thinking of going into politics and
No, I'm looking
to
I'm looking to support the next generation of black leaders. I'm 62 now. I have my stripes. I've been on the battlefield for 40 years. I love what I do, and I like representing my community. That I'll never stop doing and advocating for them. But I want to invest my time in bringing on the next generation of leaders so that we can get this cross-cultural unity between these different hyper-diverse African communities that we have here that need to be knitted together in order to create the kind of organization we were speaking about. So partly what we do with blacksocks.com is to do work that helps deliver that vision.
Okay, 2 more questions for you because we've got about 14 more minutes.
I'm going after that.
Okay, yeah, definitely. But this one is very interesting. It says, how goes the Black Operation Vote? That's 0K. How goes Black Operation Vote? Because you just said,
it goes very well.
We're not really registered. Not many in the black community have registered to vote.
Well, the level is 25% nationally, but the African and Caribbean communities have actually seen an increase in their votes, although the overall 25% includes Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and other ethnic minorities. So they partly make up that figure. For our community and the African and Caribbean community, the African community has got the highest voter registration group of any African ethnic group. And so I think they come with a greater appreciation of the importance of democracy. And because they have to fight so hard as well to get immigration status, it means a lot more to them when they do get it, that they exercise their right to vote. So Operation Black Vote is doing well, and you may know that Simon Woolley, who's its chief executive, was recently made Lord Simon Woolley, and is now a member of the House of Lords. They've got a voter registration campaign that they developed with Saatchi and Saatchi, which is on the Operation Black Vote website. So people should go along to the website, catch up with Operation Black Vote, see what they're doing, and get involved.
Fantastic. Well, this is one that will make you smile as well. And I want to really appreciate you for taking your time out, speaking to us here on Feferity Radio. This question is from 0K. It says, if you could go or travel back in time and chat with the first black mayor, John Archer, what would you say to him?
I think I'd have to ask him, how did he do it? How in the world did you manage to get elected given the times that they were in? So I would be all eager to learn from somebody who's succeeded in a much more hostile environment than we do have today. So yeah, I think I'd be in awe of his experience and want him to tell me every jot and detail of his, how he managed to do it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Lee Jasper, for taking your time speaking to us here at Freestyle on
No,
Feferity Radio. And we wish you all the best. Could you give us any information about where people should link? I know you got your official blog, but any information you want to pass on?
yeah, you can find Lee Jasper Drive Time on Twitter. You can find Lee Jasper on Facebook, Instagram, and you can link into my YouTube channel where you see lots of videos of interviews of me discussing various other topics which may be of interest to you. So thanks very much for the interview. I've enjoyed it, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much, Lee Jasper, and have yourself a beautiful time wherever you go, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was Lee Jasper there giving us his own views, experience on the black issue, the black vote, the election, and everything else. I mean, the most important thing, like said, if he was to go back in time and speak to the first black mayor in this country, John Archer, and he says he would be in awe. He wants to know everything. Won't we all? But thank you very much, Lee Jasper. And my name is Freestyle, and you're listening to Feferity Radio.
Feferity Radio, best for African music.
Well, let's play you now some fella before we leave you.